My name's Emily Clark and I'm Highgate's Development Director. So you in the audience can't see one another, but we're here at an Ultramilian Law Society event, and I can see that as well as OCs, we're joined by many members of the Highgate pupil body and students from our partner schools, many of whom are here because they're interested in a career in law. And who better to listen to for inspiration than our speaker, Michael Mansfield QC. We're absolutely delighted to have Michael with us this evening. For many, he needs no introduction, but Michael might be too modest to share all of his achievements. So let me just touch on the highlights. Starting with his school career. So Michael was a talented sportsman and he joined Highgate in 1954. He left for Keele University in 1960, where he was secretary of the Students' Union before graduating with a joint honours in history and philosophy. 7 years later, Michael was called to the bar and was appointed Queen's Counsel in 1989. In 2007, Michael was elected a bencher of Gray's Inn, and he's currently head of chambers at Nexus Chambers in Lincoln's Inn. Michael's been in the courtroom for over 40 years. Most of us here will know some of his notable cases. He's represented the families of Stephen Lawrence and Mark Duggan, as well as the families involved in the Hillsborough Football Stadium disaster and, more recently, families in the Grenfell Towers inquiry. He's also an environmental and animal rights activist who's been outspoken against the meat production industry and was vegetarian before it was part of the course to be vegetarian. We've had lots of really interesting questions submitted in advance, so thank you to everyone who sent a question in. These will be taken throughout the conversation and we'll come on to the ones that we don't get onto at the end once we've heard from Michael. Michael describes himself as a radical lawyer. He's also told me already this evening that he plans to be a nightmare, and he's certainly a tour de force. So it's my absolute pleasure to hand over to him. Michael, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy to hear the things you've had to say. It makes it a little bit easier. And welcome to, as I gather, hundreds of people. And it's a pity we can't all see each other. However, I was just saying to Emily before we started, I mean, I'm in a situation where I'm conducting court cases from here as well. I'm in an office at the moment at home, but I live in Warwickshire. I don't live in London. And I was explaining that last week I had to do a hearing. And the judges wanted me to put my wig and gown on, and I'm sitting in the kitchen here. I mean, it's that's the surreality in which we all live. However, I thought perhaps the most important thing, because there's obviously a diverse cross-section of people from schools in North London, if I just said a little bit about myself and how I've got here, because many of you, if you really are wanting a career in the law, whether as a barrister or solicitor or some other situation, then I think it's important, and I said it then when I started, and I say it now to all of you, that don't, unless you have a very, very clear, and this applies to all sorts of occupations, not just the law. I think you have to a very clear idea, you know, where your heart is, what it is you feel strongly about, because it will take that amount of energy and inspiration and force and impetus to take you through. But there are a lot of hurdles, but there are a lot of hurdles for everybody. I don't want to sound like John Cleese in a shoebox, but you know, when I was a boy. However, you know, when I started, there were enormous hurdles to cross. You know, I hesitate to say how long ago it was, but anyway, it's a long time ago. And I think the country had barely overcome the Second World War. And it was in a state where legal aid was just little shoots in the ground. It hadn't taken off. And I came from a background where I had no knowledge of the law, no connection, nothing. And I literally walked into the temple and knocked on doors and said, hey, how about it? You know, and they go, well, what are you doing here? Anyway, but they were very generous in the end. And that's how it began to happen. But it happened because I knew I wanted to do this. That is advocacy, hopefully on behalf of people who maybe find it more difficult to express themselves or get representation. But I wanted to explain not only that it's the passion that matters. And if you have the passion, you can do it, whatever it is. That's the first thing. Second thing is, one of the questions, and that relates to some of the questions about why I do certain cases. But there was another question being asked, what did I take away from school? Well, besides most of their pencils, I actually managed to gather from particular teachers, but unknowingly at the time, influences that have borne upon exactly what I'm doing now. Now, one of them actually is here. I'm going to hold it up. I gather you can see it just. Now, there we are. Now, some of you, I won't keep it there forever. That's probably better looking than I am anyway. But it's a charcoal drawing by a teacher at Highgate when I was there, called Kiffin Williams. Well, I believe he's got a knighthood now, but anyway, Kiffin Williams. He is, or Cuffin Williams, as I believe is the proper pronunciation. I think he's the next talk, or at least the subject matter of his work, which is an interesting coincidence because we had art lessons at a time when art was seen as kind of a bit floozy. What are we doing here? Art was seen as a soft option. It was in the art school at the top of one of the, it's probably gone now, I don't know, you do it all in different places. And we go up there and we were all laughing to each other as though it's a bit of a joke and we could sort of play around for an hour or 2 hours or whatever it was. But he was he knew exactly what he was dealing with. The first thing he said to all of us was, don't worry, you won't have to pick up a pen or I can't do his accent, obviously. I don't know that he spoke in Welsh particularly or a lilt, but he said, you won't have to touch a paintbrush this time. We'll go, wow, what is this? You know, and then he said, look, I tell you what I want you to do. I want you to think and look and observe where you live, your route to school. And each week, each of you are going to tell us in using ordinary words, nothing else, what it is you've experienced, maybe over the week or that day, that you feel matters to you, something that took your interest. And it started as a joke and people were silly, and then people warmed to it because they had the floor for 5 minutes. Some of them told true stories, some of them made them up. And it was usually possible to tell that, you know, the figments of imagination. That didn't matter because what he was trying to get you to do was to look and look at things differently. Look up, look down, look sideways, and all the a simple measure. So we all began doing that. And the second term he said, you're not going to do it anymore. I'm going to do it as the artist. And what he went through was he brought in photographs of things he'd seen. What he was trying to alert us to was well before anybody else was doing it, I think, anyway. He said, pollution. He said, what I want you to notice, which you haven't noticed, any of you haven't noticed it, is the visual pollution that is obliterating beautiful buildings, beautiful scenery throughout the whole of our country. And we all go, oh my goodness, yeah, well, we haven't noticed that. And so there's much more to it than that. But he got me unconsciously alive to environmental issues. And of course, that's carried through because there are environmental issues I'm taking cases on and campaigning for, and have been for some time. So it's not just now. I'll give you 2 examples. I think one of you picked up in one of the questions. We're taking on the 5G rollout, and we're also taking on HS2. Now, I'm not going to develop the arguments in relation to those because, you know, they're in their infancy, but just to give illustrations of the need for legal voices, moral voices, because the plight we're all facing, I think, at the moment, is born out of our attitude to the planet as a whole. It's been exploitation. It has been, how can we get from A to B quicker than we could yesterday? How can we get more communications quicker than we did yesterday? And I think that obsession has brought us up short, and people are beginning to think and reappraise what they're doing. So I think what he was doing in a very small way had a global repercussion for me. And it kind of leads me into another topic, which is an environmental topic. One of the questions was, what are the most significant breakthroughs in human rights? And the other question, which is the other side of the coin, what are, one of the threats that I think over the last decade or so? Well, they're linked, because I think the most interesting and important development since the Second World War, starting with the Universal Declaration of Rights and so on, and the setting up of the UN, but bringing it more up to date, was 1998 and the Rome Statute and the setting up of the International Criminal Court and universal jurisdiction and 5 offenses, well, 4, 1 dropped off, and I want to deal with that. The others that are still there, but war crimes you've heard about, crimes against humanity, genocide. The crime of aggression hasn't yet been ratified. But the 5th one, which got dropped off because the US objected, and the United Kingdom, perfidious Albion as it is, stayed neutral. And it didn't get onto the international statute book. But the importance of it was to alert people to a major crime that was being committed then, and still is, against the environment. If you like, systematic and systemic destruction by global companies and countries. You can obviously think, as I speak about oil companies are the obvious ones, mining companies, the destruction of our environment. Now, that's, at the moment, it's being reconsidered. So the importance of the ICC and the international statutes, I think, was to raise above national interest what is of international interest. So that was one of the most important, if you like, innovations of the century. But it's being attacked. And the attack is not going to surprise you. It's coming from, in the first place, the United States of America, which never signed up in the first place, because they didn't want to end up in the dock. That's why they didn't sign up, because they were committing war crimes all over the place. They're not alone in this, I say straight away. But what is interesting is that change of regime we've now got. And I'm hoping that Joe Biden will not do what Trump did, which he even was threatening to take away the visas of the prosecutors at the ICC. That's how bad it's getting. That's why the threats are coming from a political base about which we have to be alert. Now, that political base isn't just there, it's here as well. So another threat, as I see it personally, to civil rights and the rights of the planet and the rights of the environment and so on, and individual rights on top of that, is coming from the imposition of autocracy. In other words, Hailsham, one of our previous Lord Chancellors, not that I got on with him particularly, but he did have some interesting descriptions. One of them was that we're living in an elective dictatorship. Well, too right. Because you've got Trump over the water acting like a megalomaniac. I'm not afraid to say that. And I think a lot of other people would agree with that. Fortunately, he's gone for the moment, but make no mistake. He'll be back in his own guise or somebody else's. But over here, I'm afraid to say we're close to it with a sort of buffoonery. In other words, I don't want to run people down too much, but on the other hand, you've got to think what Boris started off doing. He started off ebullient, abrasive, get the job done. And one of the things he said, basically, which was challenged in the end, Gina Miller, Article 50. He was going to try and do it without the consent of Parliament. He also tried to prorogue Parliament and keep it prorogued so it couldn't have the debates. The Supreme Court stepped in, and then the attack started yet again on the judiciary by politicians. Interesting. Exactly what was going on in the United States. So what they do in the United States is put, political appointees into key positions. We haven't quite got to that yet. But on the other hand, we all have to be alert. Fortunately, the judiciary have been alert, and they have been putting down, and that's why next threat to individual rights, that's why this government not only made an attempt through those two illustrations I've given, they also made an attempt to actually go beyond international law, which brought the judges out again, and a lot of public opinion. The internal market bill, it's not the most exciting bedtime reading you can think of. But on the other hand, what did he do? He said, oh, well, forget what's been going on. And he was prepared to breach international law. Now, so one can say, you know, it's only over the water. It's not only over the pond. It's happening. It could happen here unless we all are alert and alive. And we have lawyers coming up the pipeline who are willing to take this kind of challenge on, because that's what's required. But there's something even more pernicious, I think, at the moment. I better watch the time. They say barristers take 5 minutes to cough, never mind speak. It's 1:15, so I'm watching the time because I want to hear from you as well. It's not just about me, it's about you and the future. Something that's happening right now, which I'm, you know, incandescent about. Now, the thing that is, and it's an extremely important issue, I think, and this is where lawyers come in, or should come in, or should speak up. Fake news. Fake news. Now, this is not an idle comedy show. I want, if I may, it's a sort of odd thing to do, I suppose. I'm going to read something. I hope you don't mind, and we might run over a minute or two. Anyway, I want to read this. While I'm reading it, I want you to think, who wrote this? In the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility because the broad masses of a nation are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily. And thus, in the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more readily fall victims to the big lie than the small lie, since they themselves often tell small lies in little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. Right, I know there's a caveat on what I'm allowed to say to these meetings, and I don't think, you know, you have a policy, which is fair enough. I'm not trying to broadcast Mein Kampf, but that's where it comes from. Adolf Hitler wrote that, and it became known as the sort of Goebbels phrase, which is, you know, if the lie is big enough and you tell it often enough, they'll believe it. Now, there is unfortunately a truth in that. And in a sense, truth is on trial at the moment. Take the United States of America. You're probably familiar with what's going on there, but pretty shocking what's going on there. A whole swathe of the public and politicians actually believed, not that the earth was flat, although if Trump had said that, I think they probably would have believed it. They actually believed that when it came to it on January the 6th or a bit later, actually their leader would be back. They had this firm, almost demonic belief that he was never going to leave. He was always going to be there. And when they interviewed people the day after, you know, they stood on top of the mountain to see the end of the world, and it didn't happen. When they interviewed all these people, they're going, why isn't he there? We feel betrayed. He said he would be there. And you go, what, you believed what he said? You believe, and of course the further lie which underlay that, which was, you know, they stole it. They stole the election. And the public believed that. Even though it went through court, even though there's no evidence, they believed it. It doesn't matter how many times you challenge it. You find people in the street saying, people generally say, well, he believed it, and they still do. Large numbers still do, but very interesting to see when Congress returns and so on, and the Senate, how it's going to pan out. But it's not alone there. What shocks me is it's right here now. And we have to be on guard because news is becoming more and more fake news. And I mean that the main channels, you've got to watch them carefully. Although I noticed on a channel I think yesterday, presenters are beginning to say there's no truth in this, which is interesting because, of course, the thing that I'm most concerned about here at the moment is the deniers. They're like the Holocaust deniers, the deniers that there is a problem. And it's not just eccentrics. There are people here who are actually on the website. I hate social media, but this is what they're doing. They're calling nurses and doctors and surgeons working on the front line ventilator killers. This is absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, off the radar again. But not only are they doing it on social media, they're actually beginning to protest outside hospitals to get people not to go and to get the staff not to go in. And if they don't do that, they're invading the hospitals. So the fake news that's being broadcast, and it comes up in some cases in a sort of libertarian argument, you're allowed to sort of make choices. No, I'm sorry, you're not. And there is and something else that we campaigned for, it stemmed out of cases like Lawrence, which is incitement to racial hatred. It's all very well talking about freedom of speech, but there have to be, I'm afraid, limits. Now, we've decided in the United Kingdom that we're not going to adopt, which a lot of other autocracies do have, are laws about sedition, obscene publications, blasphemy, and so on. On the other hand, where you have a situation that people's health and safety are being put at risk by essentially fake news, and one of the rows that blew up yesterday, you may have noticed, is the Tory MP for the New Forest, I think his name is Swain, who's been saying, oh, these figures have been manipulated, it's no worse than flu. And they actually got round to saying, well, you better withdraw it. The fact is that I think where there are untruths being spoken, I'm not suggesting there should always be a legal case in relation to it, but I think freedom of speech is a very precious commodity. And it only, as it were, survives and thrives when we, as it were, root out untruths that are being spoken in the name of free speech. That means essentially that we have to protect that, legally speaking, and we have to also speak up in favor of that. So that area, I think, is extremely important. Now, I want to come back to Highgate for a moment, because there was another master at Highgate who, without me realizing it again, actually inculcated a sense of questioning and challenging, which has lasted till this day. His name was Fabian. I can't remember his first name. I'm sorry about that. He was a professional footballer. I think he played for Corinthian Casuals. I don't even know whether they still exist. And at least didn't play for Spurs. I gather they are the partner of one of the schools. Anyway, he taught English, and he had a very interesting way of doing it. On a Monday morning, the lesson was usually at 9 or something in a place called the Dungeons. I don't even know whether they exist at the school anymore. And he'd start the lesson by reading out a sports report of a football match. And we'd all go. And then he'd say, have you been listening? And most of us did a bit. And then he'd say, right, well, what do you think of this? And we'd all say, well, the wrong team run. No, well, not what you think of it. What do you think of the writing and the content, generally speaking? We said, well, and he said, well, first of all, the English is bad. And then he went through that. And then he said, how do you know it's true? And we go, what do you mean? You weren't at the match, were you? So, no. So what are you doing? You're resting your faith on the author of the article. But I can tell you in this particular case, because he'd watched the match, there are serious errors. Now, they're not untruths of the kind that are deliberate to mislead. But what he was leading to is that some commentators, even then, obviously got carried away and were beginning to tell things that were not quite true and so forth. Now, that commentary, it led me to believe that, first of all, you don't necessarily believe everything you read in the newspapers. That's an easy thing to say. But you have to be extremely careful to challenge what you read wherever you read it, whoever the author is, including me. And by the way, you can still buy the book from Amazon that I read on my memoirs if you want to read up a more detail on this. So I think that the fact of, it being in print, and that's the problem with social media. It is, in fact, a complete, I think, anarchic situation in which people feel free to say exactly what they want. And I want, so that Emily knows I'm about to say, okay, that's as much as I want to say, but I want you say no. I want to sort of round it off by saying, And there is another reason why I'm very concerned about the way in which it is thought that you can tell a big lie and get away with it. It is what is going on social media at the moment in relation to our social situation. Myself and my wife set up an organization called SOS, which is the silence of suicide. The intention, because my daughter committed suicide 4 or 5 years ago now, and nobody wanted to use the word, nobody wanted to talk about it, and I felt it was time that, along with a lot of other people, that it's time to lift the lid, to eradicate the stigma, and to tell some truths, but not by me, but get other people to do this. And we started this, and it's been extremely successful, whereby people who've attempted suicide, think about suicide, and so on, and many of the stories that were coming through were quite shocking about what is going on social media, the bullying, and how people are being encouraged to take their own lives or at least self-mutilate. I couldn't believe that one human being would want to go that far and do it. Now, I think there is, and this comes back to what is happening in the States and here. There's an obligation on those who present. They can't just say, well, we're a platform, we have nothing to do with it. Sorry, that's not good enough. Because what is happening here, once again, is a transgression. Essentially, I mean, suicide itself is no longer a crime. Assisting suicide is. And I think that the various platforms have an obligation here in relation to it. And what we've tried to do is to combat that through the organization we've set up. Now, I come to the very present is because we need help. We need your help. And anyone who would like to go to the website under that title, SOS, they will see what we've been doing. And we need volunteers because what we've done is we've set up a hotline. A bit like the Samaritans, but not identical. They support what we're doing. Because we can't meet as we were doing, obviously, and as you would normally do, we've decided we have to do it by a telephone line, which is anonymous. And we have anybody who volunteers to do this is trained. So it's not an easy task. I've listened to many of the calls, but we need funding to help us because we're getting something like, now it's gone from when we started this telephone line in August, we're now getting something like 400 calls a day. And basically we haven't got enough people to cope. You've got to have more than one person on the line at the time. So I mention it because there might be somebody out there who would like to help us as a volunteer, or there might be somebody out there who might like to make a small contribution to our survival. So there we are. I rounded off at this point, and over to you, Emily. With I think we've got 15 odd minutes left, or 20 even maybe.
Or even 20, definitely, because that was fascinating. And a lot of the questions which we're going to be posing to you touch on things that you've just covered. First of all, I'm really interested in your views on public belief and fake news. And I'm wondering what we as a general public can do to better educate ourselves to be more critical thinkers. If you've got kind of any advice for us in the audience, irrespective of age, of how we can read the news more critically.
Well, that's a very interesting question, Emily, because in fact, I was in the process with the publishers of the book that I wrote, or one of the books I wrote, Bloomsbury, to establish a critical thinking academic course. And I think some universities do have such a course, a critical thinking course. And I think at school, it was done without that formal title. But I think for me, and interestingly, we try and do this on the telephone calls with people coming in. In other words, we don't want to intrude at this time, and we don't want to be pejorative, but what we do want to do is do what I try and do for myself every day, which is what Kevin Williams was doing. And that is, you know, I suppose in Christopher Wren, circumspect, you've got to look carefully where you are, actually where you're rooted at the moment. It doesn't matter where it is. And I know for some people it's horrific. And representing, as I know, there's another old Cholmondeley, and probably here tonight, Adrian, Grenfell, the families, they've been in a dreadful situation. Some families, one room, three kids, no support, nothing. So I realized just how bad it is and the stresses. But I think, and we deal with this on the phone. And what we're trying to do is to not, as it were, be retrospectively clever. We're just trying to ask people to ask themselves questions, because I'm a firm believer that everybody, however parlous their state, has got inside an ability to rise above the state that they're in, however economically stressed it is and emotionally stressed. So it's a matter of asking them to ask themselves certain questions if they want to. And I would say this to everybody, whatever your pursuit. At the moment, stop fixing the future with, where can I go on holiday next summer? For goodness sake, where returning to normality. Stop. The planet has been saying to us, stop. Think about what it is you really need, what it is you really want, what it is where it is that you really want to go. And are these things that you've been so attached to materially and elsewhere, or not attached if you haven't got the means, are they the real things that matter to you? And so I think when you begin that reappraisal, it's quite fundamental and it's difficult to do. You begin to realize that there are some pretty remarkable things. And I think that's what Kiffin was saying. There are remarkable things right underneath your feet. And there may be, a talent in here that's been hidden and you didn't know. It could be drawing something, writing about something, looking at something, telling a story, reaching out to other people. I don't know. It's not for me to say what is right for you, other than, the one thing you must not do is fester. The one thing you must not do is say to yourself, that's it, it's all over. Or set yourself an unrealistic future target, which is, too far down the line. They're already saying the vaccine's not going to cope with all the new viruses and variants and so on. I don't want to know that at the moment. I want to know that people can feel happy about themselves, which means you have to be introspective. Normally people are saying, look around, look out, introspective, what is it and where are you? So, I mean, that's the kind of advice I'm giving to lots of lawyers who want, don't stop, don't not do it. You can do it, but you have to think laterally now about how you're going to do it and how you're going to help.
And knowing which questions to ask and the sorts of answers you want to hit upon is key to that. So a question that has been very, very popular, I'd like to focus on one specific example, but lots of people are interested in your motivation when it comes to taking on cases. So one particular question piqued my interest, and as you know, Highgate has many current and former Jewish pupils, some of whom were shocked when you agreed to defend Ken Livingstone at his Labour Party suspension hearing. Livingstone said that Hitler supported Zionism. Is there anyone that you wouldn't be prepared to defend?
Well, I'm glad you've asked that question, because I think when I first started, again, I'm not going to bore you with going back too far, but my mother was absolutely shocked about the cases I took on. Now, that's never stopped. I mean, she's dead now, but she said, Michael, I didn't send you, you weren't sent to Highgate to end up representing, and she'd have a real go about the people I'm representing. And I think that people have to understand that there is a distinction, but it's quite a subtle one, and it's difficult to comprehend, I think, anyway, from the outside. I mean, the short answer to your question is there isn't anybody who I would not defend, but that's not the way it works. Because in a sense, who I represent is not selected by me. And you go, why? Well, because from the beginning, I've had this commitment, let's put it that way, commitment and passion to do certain things. So talking about Haringey, I'm deeply linked to Haringey, although I'm not living there now, but 25, 30 years. Because when I came back from university, I lived in Highgate, just off Southwood Lane in a little road called the Park. I then moved to Crouch End. All my children, all bar one, went to Highgate Wood. I was a governor at Highgate Wood School. I helped set up the Jackson's Lane Community Centre, hopefully for the benefit of all sorts of people. We wanted to get off the streets and bring the community together, despite their desire to widen the Archway Road, which I opposed and got a campaign to stop because it was going to build a motorway straight through the centre. So that I got onto that. So I think you're all going, oh, you know. Anyway, and then I moved on to the, I don't think it's there anymore, the Tottenham Law Centre. It was in fact the second law centre set up in London, in the United Kingdom actually. The first one was over in Notting Hill and North Kensington, which is still there and is linked to the Grenfell case that we're doing. But the Tottenham Law Centre had an objective, and it was part of what I felt was important for not only Tottenham but elsewhere, which was to provide accessible, so it's like a shop front, accessible advice on things that everybody had, you know, the bane of their lives: a roof over your head, eviction, employment, disability. And it didn't do juvenile crime, but it did all the civil, if you like, the civil difficulties that people run into, and doing it on a funded basis, so people didn't have to pay, free access. And if there wasn't legal aid, and sometimes there wasn't, we would raise the money through the local authority, Haringey, or we'd raise the money through the Lord Chancellor's Department, as it then was. So I've got that very close connection as to with Haringey. So I got known, and the point I'm coming back to is why is it work this other way around? Not me choosing the cases, but them choosing me. I got known for doing certain types of work and representing certain issues outside court. So the people who identified with that issue, so it might be issues to do with Tottenham Law Centre or the arts or whatever in Jackson Lane, would come to me. Now, obviously, there's a time element. I can't take every case that comes. You know, it's impossible. This room here that you can see is filled with stuff. I couldn't possibly do it. No barrister does everything, but there is a principle called the taxi rank principle, which you're supposed to take the next one that comes along. But we all realize it's impossible to do that. You try and do it, but you can't. So what tends to happen is some barristers say, well, we'll only do private work. Some people say, well, public funding's gone down the chute, so that's very difficult to get now. 40% cuts, that's another aspect of autocracy. So access to the courts. However, people would, in the end, select areas they wanted to practice in. And what you would do is you would not exactly take the first one, but you take the one that come along if you could do it and you had space. So the obvious example that's often given, would I represent a member of the, as it was then, National Front? And the answer to that is they wouldn't select me. And if they did, I'd be honest about it. I'd say to them, look, I don't agree with your views, but I will represent you, but I don't want you getting to the end of the road and discovering, oh my God, you don't agree with anything I say, because that you may think, if you've not got a good result, that it's been influenced by the fact that I haven't put everything into it. So it's a much more subtle process. And I think where a lot of people ask, besides the Ken Livingstone case, why I represented Mohammed Al-Fayed. Well, again, there's a lot of criticism. And I say, look, I don't represent big business, for God's sake. I'm not interested in corporate interest, but I am interested in a father who's lost his son in extraordinary circumstances, and he has a point he wants to put across. I'll do it. Plus, it obviously for me gave me an opportunity to cross-examine people who I wouldn't normally get, including the possibility of the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen, but they didn't come in the end. But in other words, it's an these are, I don't know whether the process I've tried to make clear is not one whereby I go out, I'm not allowed to tout. I can't go out in the street and say, I want to represent you, or I want to do that. I'm finding every day people are writing in with extraordinary stories and saying, can you do it? And most of them, I have to say, I can't, because I haven't got time to do it. And maybe there are lots of other people who are willing and able to do work. So do tell me if that doesn't make sense.
No, that does make sense. And it sounds like it's a very human motivation, that it's the people that make it interesting and kind of drive you on as much as it is the larger issue.
Yeah. Because they represent the issues. Yeah, I mean, I can give lots of illustrations, and I normally do it another way around, which is I say to people, look, the Lawrence family, that became a major game changer for the police. Bloody Sunday, the way the military act as police force in a domestic environment. Grenfell at the moment, I can't talk about it much because we're in it, but not allowed to, as a barrister, talk about something you're actually dealing with, but it's the same sort of thing. And this goes right back to cases very early on. A lot of the, let's say, the Birmingham 6 appeal. I mean, that's, people felt very strongly about that, my mother included, but the point was there was a miscarriage. And so I, wanted to do it. So it's the people, as you rightly say, who've educated me. I feel they've given a lot to me, things I would not have known about if they hadn't come to me. And you have to pick it up and learn about it. And I don't pretend to know about all these issues, but when somebody comes and they explain how it's affected their lives, then you recognize what it is that has to be done.
And this is why you're still working and still motivated 40 years after you started, because you're always learning. And I think that's all we can all hope for in our roles.
Well, it's 50 now, 55.
That's being kind.
So it's a long time. And I have to remember, because I still feel as though I'm back at the start, and I'm still having to find my way. And that's the challenge for me, is finding my way. There's always a new pasture to be looked at and to be examined. 5G for me, I thought, 5G was terribly technical. Actually, it's not. It means 5th generation. I thought it meant something else, So it's taking away the technocracy of language often in order to make it explicable to myself. If I can understand it, anybody can.
Good. I feel cruel bringing this evening to a close, but I feel like we should keep vaguely to time. So I'm just going to ask you 2 more questions.
I was just thinking, is that one I haven't answered? Yeah, go on.
Well, one is a very big question, and we've touched on some big issues already, but it's a simple one. Are you optimistic or are you pessimistic at the moment? Michael Mansfield, where are you sat on that issue?
Oh, I know I'm incredibly optimistic and very positive. I've always been that way, even though things are very difficult. They're difficult for everybody all the time. Each year, doesn't matter where I go back to, whether it's, I can remember rationing and what I didn't have at home and the difficulties of air raids and God knows what. So I've got a certain amount of experience. And I think the only reason I'm sitting here is I have enormous faith in the next generation and the one below that, and in humanity, and that there are people who, you look at people on the front line who are doing absolutely amazing jobs and risking themselves. And even in the midst of nothing, they stretch out and give to others. You hear these stories all the time. So I think, that provided people do not get panicked by fake news or anything else, and provided they reach out to others. I know at the moment you can't actually hug each other, much as I'd like to do it to everybody that's with you today. I think you have to hug yourself and say, yeah, it's worth it. I want to get up tomorrow. And that's what I do. I want to get up tomorrow. So I'm not feeling downcast. I think there's going to be, terrible things are going to happen, as they've done before throughout the whole of my life, but we'll get there.
I think that's a very, very good way to look at things, and a very nice note to almost draw the evening to a close on. I'm going to go back right to where we started, which is your advice for the next generation on which you're hanging your optimism. We've got many students with us today who will be really interested in your thoughts on kind of what you would be doing and thinking if you were a 16, 18, 20-year-old now interested in a career in the law. So I know you touched on it already, but if you've got a few more kind of words of advice for our younger viewers, that'd be a really nice thing to finish on.
Okay, here it is. I do think about that, how I would do it now. It wouldn't be very different. I haven't really talked about the first work that I did, which was dealing with drug addicts. How did I get into that? I don't know how I got into it. I didn't take drugs. I didn't know anything about them. But somehow or another, a friend of mine said, would you come and help another lawyer at a drug dependency clinic under Hungerford Bridge in London? I said, yeah, okay, I'll come along. And we were giving advice on the law at the time. And then actually we went further than that, and we wrote a book and we lobbied Parliament to make sense of the drugs law. And then because of the work we were doing outside the court, I became known for that kind of work at that time, and did a lot of cases in relation to that. And I'm still concerned about drug use, obviously. So what's the point? The point is, I think it goes back to the heart question. You have to think about what it is, what contribution do you want to make to where you are? Now, if I was, I hesitate to say this because I'll have them knocking on my door next, but I think if I were a young person, I'd be thinking seriously about the environment, and I'd be thinking about how I can do something to stop the desecration. Now, it may be not going as far as digging a hole under Euston Station or setting up a tree, but there've been people near here, near where I live, protecting. It's gone. They took it down. A pear tree, 400 years old, gone. And they were risking, bulldozers bulldozing all of them. I think you have to get involved in things that matter for the community. And once you do that, where you go within the law will be determined by what it is you feel committed to. And of course, there are lawyers who don't want to be involved. Okay, well, then they can go for, I don't say a different kind of law altogether, which is, doing contract law, tax advice, and so on. That's fine. But for me, I want to be involved with the issues that underlie the cases. And if I've been involved, then people know I'm not doing it just for the sake of it.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I am going to make myself the most unpopular person in this Zoom room, and I am going to bring this evening to a close. I think we could go on for many hours more. But thank you, Michael, very much for such an interesting and engaging insight into the law. Thank you on behalf of the school and on behalf of the OC Society.